Let me tell you what Ibrahim Traoré is doing. He has got agricultural projects. Burkina Faso is having a farming boom right now because of this great African leader. He has just made a law that any woman who has a child, her medical bills are completely eliminated. It's free to go to the doctor and have a child in Burkina Faso in this African country because mothers and maternal care is so important. Donald Trump, look at this man. Try to be like him. Don't be like Zelensky. Don't be a worm. Be a president like Ibrahim Traoré. A shocking scene unfolded in New York. Protesters chanted the name of an African military leader, Ibrahim Traoré, as they marched against Trump. Why him? Why now? And what does this say about the future of global resistance? Let's find out. What started as a single name on a cardboard sign soon became a full-blown political phenomenon. In less than 48 hours, Traoré was no longer just a name known to Burkina Faso or Sahel observers. It was echoing through the streets of the world's most powerful country. But this wasn't random, and it wasn't hype. It was a cry from people who were starved of something real, authentic leadership. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to icon status in the US didn't happen because Americans suddenly became interested in West African politics. It happened because they saw something in him that they no longer saw in their leaders: moral clarity. In a time when trust in government is eroding fast, when politicians on both sides of the aisle seem more interested in power than principle, Traoré stood out, not because he pandered, but because he didn't. When he took over as president in 2022, Traoré didn't give flowery speeches or beg for applause. He declared war on dependency, both military and economic. He expelled French forces, refused IMF conditionalities, built homegrown food and transportation systems, and refused to be treated like a chutty. Righty case by the West. These weren't just policy decisions. They were acts of defiance, symbolic ruptures from the post-sea colonial script the West had forced African nations to follow. But Americans didn't just see defiance. They saw a blueprint, a way out of their spiral of apathy, corruption, and disillusionment. Because for Black Americans in particular, the image of a young African leader standing against empires felt like reclamation. For decades they had been fed two ideas: that Africa was a place of suffering, and that leadership required compromise. But Traoré shattered both. He showed the world that a black man in power could be strategic, militant, honest, and wildly popular without Western approval. That's when the first videos started going viral. A short clip of Traoré and his fatigues calmly telling journalists, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity." Hit TikTok like a grenade. Black creators stitched it with scenes of US protests, police brutality, food insecurity, and gentrification. The message was clear. He may be in Africa, but he's speaking for us. Soon after, digital artists began designing posters with his face superimposed on civil rights murals. He became a proxy for the conversation no one dared to have out loud. What if true leadership only exists outside the system? What made it even more powerful was that Traoré hadn't done a single interview with American media. He hadn't tried to win over the Western audience. That silence, that lack of PR polishing, made him even more compelling. In a world of political theater, he felt raw, untouched by the marketing machines. And that rawness was magnetic. There's another reason he struck such a nerve. Traoré's age, mid-30s, made him feel like one of the people. Not a career politician, not a billionaire, not a lifeless bureaucrat. Just a young soldier turned leader who sounded like the streets he came from. And in the eyes of the protesters, that authenticity transcended borders. It wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about a feeling that something had been taken from people around the world. A voice, a future, a sense of control. And that somehow this man dared to take it back. And in doing so, he became more than a president. He became a mirror, a symbol of what leadership looks like when it grows from struggle, not privilege. So when American protesters started chanting his name, they weren't admiring a foreign leader from afar. They were calling for a different kind of power, one that doesn't bow, doesn't beg, and doesn't break. But what took this movement from admiration to action was what came next. The slogans, the chants, the street visuals that flooded America's biggest cities. That's where we go next. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. It started quietly, just a few posters held high, drawn in thick markers by college students and community organizers. But within days, the name Traoré was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. Across Los Angeles, a group of young activists formed a human chain outside the federal building, holding signs that read, "Burkina Faso rises while America sleeps." Traoré said number, so should we. In Atlanta, where the weight of civil rights history still hangs in the air, marchers carried massive banners with a hand-painted portrait of Trey, his military beret, his intense eyes, his unshakable calm. Beneath it were 3 words: "We remember Sankara." But it wasn't just his image, it was the emotion behind it. His defiance had become the people's defiance, and in the protests raging against Trump's immigration bans, rising police violence, and the deepening racial wealth divide, Traoré had beaten, in caste not by himself, but by the people as a vessel for rebellion. The crowd roared, "Hands off Traoré! Hands off Africa!" It wasn't performative, it was prophetic. Soon, art collectives began designing high-resolution stencils of Traoré's silhouette, spray-painted in bold black across the walls of Harlem, Oakland, and even Miami. His face began to appear on stickers slapped across subway trains, benches, and traffic poles next to slogans like, "Build like Tro." "The revolution wears a beret. This is what dignity looks like." And then came the slogans that cut deepest, those aimed not just at celebrating Traoré, but shaming the American political elite. Trump fears what Traoré represents. Even the digital space wasn't spared. TikTok edits set to protest anthems began circulating, juxtaposing Traoré's speeches with clips of American poverty, housing injustice, and brutal police crackdowns. By this point, Traoré's image had broken through the cultural firewall. It wasn't just activists and students anymore. Celebrities began retweeting his quotes. But what truly shook the establishment wasn't the volume. It was the depth. These weren't surface-level gestures. They were a cry for a new standard, a demand for leadership that looked, sounded, and fought for the people. The slogans weren't romantic, they were strategic. The streets weren't just expressing grief, they were expressing instructions. The protests became a classroom. The slogans became history lessons. And through it all, Traoré became the lens through which Americans, especially black and immigrant communities, re-examined their broken systems. But the movement didn't stop at the visuals or chants. As momentum grew, the political ripple effects began hitting Washington. The very system that had once ignored African resistance suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of comparison. In political briefings, in intelligence reports began highlighting a curious trend. An African military leader was becoming a central figure in U.S. protests. For a country that had long ignored African politics, except when it suited resource grabs or military interests, this was jarring. Not just because it was unexpected, but because it was embarrassing. Trump's carefully orchestrated narrative, that of strong borders, secure America, and dominance over problematic foreign nations, was suddenly being undone by a single man he never planned to talk about. Traoré wasn't supposed to be part of the story, but now he was the story, and worst of all, he didn't have to lift a finger. While Trump's team scrambled to justify the inclusion of 25 African nations in the new visa ban expansion, protesters were flooding Capitol Hill with petitions and congressional offices with calls demanding clarity. Why are we banning nations from building their futures? Why are we targeting Africans who are doing what America says it wants: independence, order, and strength? This wasn't just optics. This was ideological exposure. Trump's policies were being held up against a living, breathing example of what true leadership looks like in the eyes of the public. And the contrast was brutal. While Trump promised to make America great again, protesters asked a sharper question. If greatness means sanctions, bans and bullying, then why does Traoré look more like a liberator than our president? Traoré had become more than a name. He was now a measuring stick, a point of comparison so damning that even centrist Democrats found themselves awkwardly silent when confronted with protester questions like, why do we fund military bases in Africa but ignore their homegrown leaders? Why does our media cover African coups more than African innovation? Why are we banning people from the very nations we help destabilize? It was a rare reversal of roles. An African leader becoming the mirror in which the Western world saw its failure, and as Trump scrambled to gain control of the narrative, one truth had already cemented itself in the minds of thousands. Traoré didn't just reject foreign control in Africa, he exposed its hypocrisy in America. But the story doesn't end there. As this resistance grew deeper, it awakened something even bigger. A Pan-African consciousness stretching across continents. The next wave was no longer just protest. It was identity. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue. Now, by the time Traoré's name had been shouted through megaphones and painted across protest murals, something more profound had begun to stir. Not in the White House, but deep in the minds of the diaspora. What began as a political statement was now becoming a cultural ignition. For many African Americans and first-generation immigrants, this wasn't just about foreign policy anymore. This was personal. Traoré had become a bridge. For generations, Black Americans were taught explicitly and subtly that Africa was distant, chaotic, and tragic. School books focused on famine and war. Hollywood fed them images of poverty and helplessness. News cycles only lit up for coups or conflict. The result, a psychological separation, a belief, even among the descendants of the enslaved, that Africa was something to mourn, not mirror. But Traoré shattered that narrative. Here was a young, unapologetically African leader who didn't fit any Western mold. He wasn't begging the IMF. He wasn't bowing at G7 summits. He didn't wear the polished smiles of diplomats trained by colonial systems. He wore fatigue, fire, and focus. And he spoke in a language of dignity, not dependency. For the diaspora, especially Black Americans raised on stories of MLK and Malcolm, of Angela Davis and Fred Hampton, Traoré was something they hadn't seen in years, a reflection of Black power that didn't ask permission. That's when community centers and grassroots hubs began shifting focus. In Detroit, a youth group scrapped its usual curriculum on Black History Month and instead held a workshop titled From Sankura to Traoré, Africa's Resistance Never Died. Young Black Americans began calling themselves children of Sankura, descendants of Traoré, not just as metaphors, but as identity. The Pan-African flame, once doused by centuries of division, had caught fire again. Even in the digital space, this awakening took form. Black artists redesigned African flags with American color schemes. Diaspora influencers created a series comparing African governance models to broken US institutions. Pages once dedicated to Black Lives Matter began including updates on AES Alliance of Sahel States meetings. Hashtags like Duction Reclaim Africa and Diaspora to Dignity trended alongside Traoré's name. But perhaps the most striking change was this. People stopped seeing Africa as a continent that needed saving and started seeing it as a source of strategy. No longer was Burkina Faso one of the poorest countries. Now it is the place that has built 500 electric buses without foreign aid. Now it was the nation that told France to leave and still stood tall. Now it was the land whose leader inspired protest slogans in Harlem and Houston. This was more than admiration. It was a reclamation. The African diaspora in America had long struggled to connect with the continent in a way that felt real, not ceremonial. But now with Traoré's rise, they had something tangible. Not just a leader, but a direction. Not just nostalgia, but a new mission to restore the broken ties between continents. Not through institutions, but through shared resistance. And that resistance wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was practical, political, and powerful. Which leads us to the final question. Now that the chants have echoed, the murals are painted, and the diaspora has begun to wake up, where does this all lead? Ibrahim Traoré didn't campaign for global admiration. He didn't ask to become a political weapon in a foreign protest. But the reality is the symbolism he now carries can't be undone. In the minds of many, he's no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He's the face of possibility in a world full of political frauds. But now comes the harder part. What do people do with that possibility? Across the US, protest organizers are beginning to ask tougher, more grounded questions. Can Traoré's defiance be translated into local action? Can communities in Baltimore, St. Louis, or Oakland take cues from Burkina Faso's local production model and reject corporate dependence? Can schools in America's black neighborhoods start teaching African governance, not just slavery and civil rights? Already some are trying. A cooperative in Chicago's South Side is building an urban agriculture pilot inspired by Burkina Faso's food independence strategy. In Brooklyn, a Pan-African film festival is rebranding its lineup to showcase modern African leadership rather than recycled colonial trauma. And in Atlanta, a grassroots initiative is launching a Traoré study series aiming to explore what post-aid economics would look like in American inner cities. This shift in mindset is profound. For the first time in decades, African Amines aren't just reacting to trauma. They're borrowing strategy from strength. The relationship with Africa is no longer paternal or abstract. It's tactical, intentional. Even politically, the ripple is spreading. Candidates running for city council and local office in US urban centers are referencing Africa not as a victim, but as a model. One progressive candidate in Minneapolis recently made headlines for stating, "We don't need Wall Street. We need what Traoré has control over our food, energy, and land." It's a seismic cultural pivot, and it's scaring the establishment. Western policymakers, long used to seeing Africa as a backroom charity case, are now scrambling to understand how a young African leader became a guiding star for Western protest movements. Reports from think tanks warn of ideological contagion, a term previously reserved for revolutionary Latin America. But they're right to be worried because what's happening is bigger than a protest. It's a philosophical rebellion, and it's asking a question the US political elite have no answer for. If a poor sanctioned African nation can fight for its people without apology, why can't the richest country in the world? Traoré's example exposes the hypocrisy embedded in Western liberal democracies, the idea that change must be slow, negotiated, and always respectful to those in power. Traoré didn't wait for permission. He didn't write polite letters. He acted, and in doing so, he's inspired a generation that's tired of waiting. But there's a danger too. Symbolism without structure fades. If this new awakening around Traoré becomes just another trend, flattened into t-shirts and Instagram quotes, it will dissolve like all the others. That's why organizers, educators, and thinkers are now emphasizing institutional memory. Not just remembering what Traoré did, but understanding how he did it. Not just praising him, but replicating him. In essence, the future of this movement rests on one question. Can admiration turn into application? Because if it can, then we're not just witnessing a cultural moment, we're witnessing the birth of a global shift, one where leadership isn't defined by geography or GDP, but by clarity, courage, and community. One where Burkina Faso doesn't follow the world. The world follows Burkina Faso. The protests may have begun as outrage against Trump, but what they revealed was a hunger far deeper for sovereignty, for connection, for heroes who don't sell out. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger is about to reshape not just American politics, but the very balance of global power. Do you think an African leader's name